Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's online educational course presented by Seattle City Lights Lighting Design Lab. My name is John Wilson. I'll be helping launch the event and getting us started today. First things first, everybody is in listen-only mode, so your phone should be muted whether you're on computer or dialing in by phone. If you'd like to reach out to LDL staff with a question, please use the chat feature. Folks experiencing bandwidth issues may be prompted to close the presenter's live webcam feed. This won't remove you from the webinar. It just helps open up a little bandwidth so you can hear us better. A recording of today's webinar will be made available and will be posted on the LDL's YouTube channel. When you exit today's webinar, you'll see a short evaluation pop up in your web browser. We do this so we don't have to send you additional emails, and it takes less than a minute to complete. We really appreciate it when you provide us with this feedback, so please take a moment to do so. And now, I'd like to introduce the presenter of today's course, Light and Human Perception, Shaun Darragh, Senior Lighting Specialist with Seattle City Lights Lighting Design Lab.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone to what is likely to be the first of a series of online educational content delivery that we are putting together. We're starting with our Fundamentals of Lighting series. This, of course, is the first of that series, 101, Light and Human Perception. So, some of you have taken classes with me before. You know I'm a little bit of a mobile presenter. I'm going to do my best. So please bear with us as we learn the ins and outs of a new method of class delivery. So as John mentioned, or as I mentioned, we are here to talk about light and human perception. So it's 101. Bearing in mind, this is a fundamentals class. So we're going to go through some of the fundamentals of this stuff, and we may wind up eventually adding the 300 level light and human perception class, which delves much further into issues of, in particular, light and health and non-vision forming systems. So quick bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I am a lighting designer. I've been a lighting designer for more than 30 years now in various parts of the industry. This is my second stint with the Lighting Design Lab. I was fortunate enough to be with the lab in the early 2000s teaching, and I came back several years ago to do classes very much like this. But through most of my career, I have been a professional lighting designer, so bear in mind that most of my background comes from the visual side of light and lighting. Now, that's all fine and all, but we're going to start with today's first pop quiz, which is really all about you folks. So I know all about myself, but what I'm really interested in is all of you. So if you'd be kind enough to go ahead and make use of the quick poll that we've put up here, we'll give you a few seconds to do that, and select which role basically most suits you with respect to this. So we'll give you just another couple of minutes. Well, couple seconds anyway. All right, so we've got about 70% of you have voted so far. I'm not sure if this is going to show me the results on screen or not in just a moment, so we're gonna discover that together. But just in case, what I'm seeing is that about 35% are design professionals, so architects, engineers, 5% construction professionals, contractors, electricians, and so forth, 10% facility professionals, 10% sales professionals, and 38% utility or government professionals. So that's an interesting mix. Of course, we at the lab tend to tailor our services to a broad spectrum of participants, so this is great. what's going to be a little bit different today, as some of you know, I really like to engage the audience in discussion for classes. We're not really going to have that opportunity here. So every little bit, we're going to go ahead and have one of these quick pop quiz polls with some specific question, essentially meant to go through one of the key topics we've just been discussing. That will give us a chance to maybe delve into things just a little bit further. And then we'll also open up the segment for questions for a few minutes. So as John mentioned, if you have questions at those times, go ahead and use the is it chat or questions area to ask that, and we'll answer as many of those as we possibly can. So let's see what's about to happen as I close this. 86% voted. Nope, it doesn't show. All right, well that's good. I'll tell you what those things are. All right, so we've gone through that. Let's go to the next thing. So today's learning outcomes, we're really going to be talking a little bit about fundamental light source metrics, a little bit about the physiology of the human eye, and try to give us a bit of a framework for how we not only see things, but how we derive meaning from some of those things, and also why it's important in some ways. We're going to describe a little bit about a fairly simple framework so that we have a good understanding of how we can apply some of what we're talking about. And then we'll actually show you some practical application methods about lighting delivery. So hopefully that will be useful for everybody. And let's dive right in, shall we? So the first thing, the most important thing is to understand is that we all respond differently to light, every single one of us. Light is such an incredibly visceral thing. It's important to realize that within the world of lighting, there really are no right answers. Occasionally there's a wrong answer, but for the most part, as long as you like something, as long as you can defend why you like it and potentially how it's useful, it's kind of okay, right? So that's really important to understand. And we have two images of striking light sources here. Of course, they're both the sun. You know, in one case, the Vermeer light kind of represents sort of the outside and you know, wonder. And in the case of Edward Hopper, most folks sort of think of the light in this case as something that's very stark or very isolating. So we've got strong light sources that really can essentially mean different things to different people. So this is kind of what I mean. Light is such a visceral thing. Everybody has a reaction to it, and that's cool. So why is this so critical? Well, as sighted people, if you talk to a sensation and perception psychologist, as much as 80% of all of the environmental information that our brains process comes in through our eyes. And thinking about that, 100% of that information that comes in through our eyes happens from light, from a light source striking a surface and then being reflected into our eyes so that we can perceive it. We'll talk a little bit about how some of those things happen. But first, let's kind of step back a little bit here. One of the seminal lighting designers, certainly in the last century, but really within our field, was a fellow named Bill Lamb. Bill is a really, really interesting fellow. He wrote a book in the 1970s called Perception and Lighting as Form Givers for Architecture. In that book, he identified 8 basic biological needs. Now, these are not specific to lighting, but lighting is intrinsic in all of them. Remember, he was talking about perception and lighting. So each of those kind of ties into some of the things that we'll be talking about today. We'll go ahead and try to circle back into some of these specific biological needs as we talk about a variety of different things. So what are they? Well, location. So where are we, right? Where are we within the building? Where are we within a planet? Where are we with respect to water, heat, sunlight, all these things? Time. What time is it, right? We all want to know what time it is. And in fact, as we push further with some of our understanding of the eye, we start to realize, and we'll talk briefly about this, that light has a very important aspect with respect to our chronobiology, right? With respect to our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian rhythms. Weather. What is the weather outside? Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it raining? Is it not raining? All these things. Enclosure. So the safety of the space around us, we want to be able to see. This is kind of why in some cases, if you can't see structure around you, sometimes it starts to feel a little bit daunting, right? Other living things, the presence of plants, animals, people, territory. What's the surround? What's around us? We've all been in a park at night when it's very dark, and it can also become a little bit daunting sometimes, right? Relaxation and stimulation. I would call that aesthetics. We want to have light that is pleasing for us, right? And places of refuge, shelter, right, in times of danger. So all of these things are intrinsic and they're really important to us, and we can use light to affect all of them. So pushing forward with that, and we kind of talk about this whole health and well-being thing, how do we start to make some of this a little bit practical? Well, there was a study that was done, I love this study, in 1971, a couple of researchers, Aldsworth and Bridgers, and they were studying an installation at an electric utility in San Antonio, Texas. In fact, the upper right photograph there is one of the control rooms that they were looking at. Now, you'll notice at the time, it actually has some pretty, what we would consider today to be pretty okay lighting, right? It's mostly indirect, it's pretty calm. The thing is, it's also unvarying, right? So I very rarely read slides, but I love to read this, so I'm going to. Unvarying electric light can lead to low-level sensory deprivation manifested by impairment of organized thinking, oppression, depression, confusion, suggestibility, and general irritability. Now, if we were all in the room together, I'd ask you to raise your hands and say, how many of you at the end of the day have felt impaired, depressed, confused, suggestible, irritable? And every one of us would raise our hands, right? We'd have a good little laugh. But the key thing here is that we as a species aren't really meant to be in spaces for very, very long periods of time that are unchanging. We need cues, we need variability, we need dynamic change. So one of the ways to do that is to do things like provide daylight and view to the outside. That's a very obvious one. We'll talk about some others as we push through, but the important things here are things like the regulation of our chronobiology, visual fatigue, and we'll see how some of this stuff comes together. And there's also an idea of biophilia, right? I think of biophilia when I really go ahead and distill it down to its most basic concept. That seems to me to be variable, right? It means that things change. Everything in nature changes. So we want our buildings to do that as well. So if we think about this whole variability, impressions, and suggestibility and all, we look at an office like this, and this used to be how we designed all of our offices, right? We would have the gentlemen there in the suits. Well, they've got corner offices, so they're going to be fine because they've got daylight, right? But what about the poor folks in the open office here that's in the center that are completely divorced from daylight? They have no ability to see what's happening outside. They have no actual natural light. Those people are going to be pretty unhappy by the end of the day. Fortunately, we tend not to design offices like this anymore, right? We tend to bring the private offices inboard and leave the open plan offices outboard, except in certain circumstances. If you go to a university, professors tend to like the window walls. So do lawyers. So it's not always the case, but let's move forward. So let's start with the idea of what is light, right? Light is this little small bit of the electromagnetic spectrum to which our eyes respond, right? We have encoders in our eyes that are excited by these little bits of this spectrum. We'll talk very specifically about them. It's a little tiny bit of that. All right, so an initial question that I get all the time is, does it really matter about the light source? Very frequently, I hear people tell me, I don't like fluorescent, I don't like LED, I don't like whatever it happens to be. The reality is that as an electromagnetic phenomenon, it doesn't matter what is generating the wavelength of light, right? The sun, an LED puck, whatever it happens to be, a candle. Now, there are very specific differences within the overall beam of light, but a wavelength of light at, say, 500 nanometers coming from the sun is physically no different than a wavelength of light at 500 nanometers coming from a Zaccato puck there. So understand that, and we'll figure out how we can quantify these things a little bit better as we push forward. So how do we begin to describe light, right? You know, we have four different, two sets of photographs here that clearly the light is very different. How do we start to describe that? How do we start to communicate these things with other people? Well, one of the things that we can do is go ahead and put together very long definitions. Luminance, the quotient of the luminous flux at an element of the surface. I'm not going to read any more of that. If you want long definitions, fantastic. The IES, the Illuminating Engineering Society, has recently made RP 1617, which is their nomenclature and definitions for illumination engineering, available free of charge to everybody online. So if you want long scientific definitions, go ahead and come to the IES standards definitions. That this link will bring you there. It's a fantastic resource, and thank you to the IES for doing that. For our purposes today, since we have a relatively constrained amount of time with each other, we're going to, let's say, take some shortcuts, be a little bit less precise, and talk a little more colloquially. So two of the key concepts with respect to lighting design are the ideas of luminance and illuminance, right? So luminance is the light striking a surface or exiting a light source. So if I've got my phone here in front of me, the light striking, the light that is bouncing off of this phone is the luminance, right? That's how bright it is. Illuminance is the light striking incident upon a surface. So it's the light that comes from a light source, hits the phone, and then bounces back as luminance. So these are the two key concepts. Luminance is referred to as candela per meter squared. We'll see what candela are in a moment. And illuminance is the old friend, the foot candle, or in SI units, the lux, right? So let's talk a little bit about them. How do we start to grab those things? So if we talk about quantity and intensity of light, we have two key concepts here. One is the lumen. A lumen is a unit of luminous flux, a measure of the total light emitted by a light source. Essentially, think of this as pounds of light. How much overall light is coming out of a light source, right? And you will typically find this information in a luminaire cut sheet, or if, for example, you're buying a consumer product at Home Depot or somewhere, you'll look on the box and you'll see lighting facts, and it will tell you light output lumens, right? So that will tell you, that will give you a good means of comparing light source to light source in a simple manner. Now, if we take that idea of luminous flux or lumen and we add a directional component, we get the idea of a candela. So candela has a vector component to it, right? So one candela is 1 lumen per steradian. What the heck does that mean? So a steradian is essentially, without going too far into this, it's the subtended angle of the area you can see on that the sphere that's there. For 1 unit area, we wind up having 1 lumen per that area, right? And we express this in candelas. Okay, without going too deeply into this, let's make this really simple. 1 foot candle, we have 1 candle, 1 candela at the center there, 1 foot to 1 foot to 1 foot. Essentially, think of this is simplified because it would really be a sphere that we'd be looking at. But this essentially gives you the idea of where we come up with this idea of 1 foot candle. If we were talking about lux, we would change the units from foot to meter. So we would have 1 meter distant and then 1 meter square. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So if that's our basic unit there. What about intensity at a distance, right? So we also have this idea called the inverse square law, which basically means that without kind of, again, reading all of this, you guys can read this stuff on your own in the handout, but the simple idea is that we have a light source here, and it's emanating omnidirectionally, right? So as it's coming out in this distance for this steradian that's here, right? At 1 r, we have 1 radius, we have 1 intensity, right? As we extend out to 2r, we essentially subtend a much larger angle, so we essentially have 4 times the area, right? So 2 squared is 4. If we go out to 3 radii, we wind up having 9, right? Because we have now 3 squared is 9, right? So we have 9 times the area that initial radiation is being sent to, right? So again, how to make this practical? One of the key things about this is the closer we can have a light source to a surface or a task that we're lighting, the less energy we have to use in order to make that surface a certain brightness, right? This is the reason that, for example, we tend as lighting designers to really gravitate towards things like task ambient lighting solutions so that we can bring the light closer to what we need to light. I'll show you some examples of that as we push forward in just a little bit. Now let me redock the spotlight there, and okay. So that's a little bit about intensity and quantity and how much light, right? Let's talk a little bit about the character of the light itself. Every light source has what we call an SPD, which is spectral power distribution. So essentially, we have an agglomeration of different wavelengths within that little bit of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. And we can go ahead and plot them in curves that look an awful lot like this, that tell us that, let's say at 500 nanometers, we have X amount of light within our light beam. At 700 nanometers into the red, we have Y amount, right? This gives us a way to characterize how the colors that we are likely to see from that light source bouncing off of surfaces will come back to us, how we can interpret them. So a fairly extreme example would be something like this, where if we've got a red apple, right, the color spectrum that is presented at the top there is a triphosphorescent light source. It has a blue spike, it has a green spike, it has a red spike. If we eliminate the blue and the red spikes and we only have a little bit of the green, that sort of starts to be like low pressure sodium light, in which case we would have very difficult time discriminating any color from that particular apple, right? Now that's a very extreme example, but the color spectrum of the light that we use for lighting our world around us has profound impacts on how we perceive those colors. Okay, so how else do we talk about that? Well, another key way that we talk about light is the idea of correlated color temperature, CCT. Now, this idea essentially comes from filament light sources. So the idea is if we take something called a black body radiator, so in physics, think of it as a hunk of iron, that if you keep heating it, you keep heating it, you keep heating it, eventually it's going to start to glow, right? The more you heat it, the whiter it's going to get. So if you heat it to 2700 K, assuming that it can't possibly melt, it would by that point, you know, it would glow like an incandescent lamp. If you heated it to 5000 Kelvin, it would probably approach the color of sunlight, right? So, so this is something, now we call this correlated color temperature because we tend not to use heat-based light sources anymore, right? We use sources that we generate color spectrum in other ways, but we still like, as people, we still like the concept or the look of incandescent lamps. So what we've done, if we take a look at, this is a CIE colorimetry chart, It basically gives us a red locus, a red point, a blue point, and a green point. And then this describes all of the colors that we can see within within human perception. And the black body curve is this line right here that essentially shows us what the color within this framework would be of that black body if we kept heating it. So at 2000, 3000, 4000, this is essentially what we perceive as white light. Now, the light sources that we talk about or that we are using in the modern world don't necessarily live on this, what we call a Planckian locus anymore. They may be below it, they may be above it, sometimes they're completely colored. So we'll see some examples of how that goes. But from a practical standpoint, oops, I have to hand that back. From a practical standpoint, come on, there we go. We can look at defining most white light sources within this whole correlated color temperature or black body curve sort of manner. So if we get down to say 1500 Kelvin, we're looking at say a candle. We go up to 6500 Kelvin, we're looking at daylight. Now on the right-hand side of the graph there, you'll see a bunch of what we typically would consider these days to be legacy light sources, right? We don't really use high pressure sodium or metal halide, ceramic metal halide much anymore. But the really interesting thing is that every single one of these color temperatures and everything in between and many more are easily achievable by LED. So really we start to think about how do we use these things most intentionally, right? How do we use these colors intentionally? And they can have fairly profound impacts. This is a series of images from Chris Meek, our very good friend at the Integrated Design Lab. Now, this is the IDL when they were in their offices on North Lake Union. Now, you can see, hopefully on your monitors, this comes through well, potentially better than on the projectors, that this is a relatively blue skylight image, right? So you'll see that most of the warm tones that you might imagine in this image that are warm tend to be quite muted, and the blues are really sort of popped out. A little bit later in the day, when there's some direct sunlight coming through, that's actually warmer, right? It's still cool to us by most metrics. You know, we've probably gone from, say 6,500 Kelvin to 5,000 Kelvin, but that has really started to warm things up a little bit, right? If we jump into the evening, when we go to, I think these are 3,000 Kelvin light sources, the compact fluorescents here, you can see that the warm tones are really coming forward, and a lot of the bluer tones have started to become a little bit deprecated, right? So making use of these kinds of phenomenon intentionally is really quite common. In fact, if we look at a chart here, we'll see that there are very common applications that we see for, say, 2700 Kelvin, very warm. Well, we tend to use things like that in residential applications or hospitality, restaurants, places like that. If we go to, say, 4000 Kelvin, we tend to use that sort of stuff in healthcare. Hospitals, sometimes big box retail spaces. Neutral, most offices tend to be in the 3500K range, right? So really there are ways that you can intentionally use these things. Okay, so we've got the idea of CCT. What about how we render colors, right? Render the look of the physical world around us. Well, we talk about that as color rendering, and this is essentially a way to ascertain how well we are going to be able to perceive the colors around us, right? This can be very important, right? This is a picture of Tommy Bahama headquarters here in Seattle. And this is their mock store. And what they're effectively doing is looking at how to merchandise things. Well, one of the important things that we talked about on this particular project was how do people perceive their garments in various light applications, right? So some of these folks are going to be looking at these shirts outdoors on a beach. Some of them are going to be looking at them in a retail environment like this. How do we make them look good in a variety of different ways? This is also very important, for example, in healthcare. In particular, there's something called skin tone diagnostics, where a doctor, when they're looking at you, they're not just looking at they're not just looking at you to be friendly, right? They're looking at your skin tone. They're looking at they may squeeze your finger. Whoops, wrong way for this. They may squeeze your finger and look for something called capillary refill. Being able to see accurate colors on your skin can tell them whether you are maybe you're relatively bluer on your skin, which might mean you're not getting enough oxygen, which might mean you're cyanotic. If your skin tone is yellower, you might look what we call jaundiced, right? So that might mean that you have a liver abnormality going on. So these kinds of things are really important. So how do we start to talk about them? Well, the scale for years has been, come on, there we go. The scale for years has been the color rendering index, CRI. And this is a very simple 0 to 100 scale, and it denotes how well a light source will render colors, how we think they should be rendered, right? So there are two reference. One is daylight, which has 100% value, and halogen, which also has 100% value. Now, you'll see there, this is an older slide that has a CRI of 85 on one side and a CRI of 70 on the other. And you can see that there are very big differences there with respect to how those colors are rendering. Now, the thing about this is that all CRI tells us is that there will be a difference. It doesn't tell us what the difference will be. It doesn't tell us, for example, whether the light source is going to make red more red or less red. It doesn't tell us whether the light source is going to make blue more blue or less blue. It really just gives us some really blunt information. And frankly, it's really easy to make LED light sources meet this criteria without actually giving us much. All right, so that's a quick bit about some of the fundamentals of how we talk about light. We're gonna circle back and talk about color rendering a little bit later after we spend a little bit of time talking about the eye. Before that, however, we have now entered our second pop quiz. So, what is a lumen? Please select one. What is a lumen? A lumen's either a sporty British roadster, a pound of light, a measure of the total light emitted by a light source, an easy way to compare light source output of consumer lamps, or a song by Mannheim Steamroller. This is your time to shine. Let us know what you think is the correct answer here. Do 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 do. I'm going to give you another 15 seconds. Those of you who haven't voted yet. All right, so we've got about 75% of you have voted already. That is good. So what have we got from our answers? 4% believe a sporty British roadster, which, well, I think that's a fantastic idea, particularly since I personally want the Sunbeam Alpine. The answer B is a pound of light. Oddly enough, a pound of light is one way that I use to describe lumens. So if you had answered pound of light, that's actually okay. Think of it colloquially. We are talking about the overall amount of light coming out of a light source. So, 500 lumens, 500 pounds of light. It's just a quick, easy way to think about it, right? Simple, simple, simple. Third one, a measure of the total light emitted by a source, which is, of course, the most correct answer of the bunch. So 89% of you grabbed that. That's good. 7% grabbed an easy way to compare light output of consumer lamps, which is also correct. I had mentioned, if you remember, that if you go to look at consumer grade lamps in particular, you will go ahead and see on the box on the lighting facts the ability to compare, say manufacturer A to manufacturer B to manufacturer C, and then within their own product lines as well. A stunning 0% of you voted for a song by Mannheim Steamroller, which interestingly enough is actually correct as well. It's on Fresh Air 5. So all but one of these was correct. All right, so I am going to close this and I'm going to say, are there any questions at this point? I can take a couple minutes to answer any questions. I'm not seeing any.
No questions submitted so far.
Okay. Well, I'm going to assume that we're all groovy, and I am going to move forward then. Let's see. So let's talk for a couple minutes about the human eye. This is a really good look at what an eye would look like, courtesy of our friends at the Illuminating Engineering Society. This is a very important bit about how we understand the world around us. There's a real bit of sort of thought that, I mean, the eye is kind of like a camera in some ways, but let's see some of the very specific elements and how they might matter to us. So let's start with the cornea, right? The cornea is the outer casing of the eye, right? It's what the light strikes first. Now, light will pass through that transparent layer, but it's really important to understand that the cornea is one of the key things that changes to us as we age. It tends in most people to yellow, to really start to not allow as much light to come through. I can tell you that the amount of light that I need to read small text at age 52 is very different than the amount of light I needed to read small text at age 18. And I suspect that most of you that are on the call will be somewhere in that kind of spectrum and will sort of understand what I'm talking about. But it's important to understand that particularly when we talk about lighting for the aged, right? And I'm getting there. So the next part is the iris. So the iris is the bit in the eye that actually expands and contracts, right? So that allows a certain amount of light to enter the eye. If there's a lot of light present in the area, the eye will constrict very small, and you'll notice in looking in a mirror that your pupil size, which is the opening, right? That pupil size will be very small. If, on the other hand, you're in a very dark environment and you look in a mirror, you'll notice that your pupil is quite large, right? So that's important. Now, because of this, we actually have, as humans, an incredible range of view. We can see over 12 different orders of magnitude of light level, from very, very, very little light to quite a bit of light. And our eye will react accordingly, right? This is much, much better than the best camera you can possibly imagine. We have this great innate ability, but at any given time, we can only see about 3 orders of magnitude range, right? So we might be able to see way down in the scotopic low light level range, but if we then introduce some photopic bright light into that, our eyes are going to change and we're going to immediately bounce over to that photopic range, right? So how do we talk about that? So we have this idea called adaptation, right? As the iris opens or closes, we adapt to light levels, right? So this happens very quickly when we go from dark to bright, right? You walk, let's say, into a grocery store at night, your eyes are dark adapted, so you are used to a relatively low light level. You walk into a grocery store, you experience a moment of ow, and then your eyes adapt to the relative brightness, right? If you're in a movie theater, by contrast, if you are sitting there, you're reading a program, the lights go down, you can't read the program anymore, right? 10 or 15 minutes later, your eyes will have adapted to the darkness and you probably can read the program again. This is why, for example, we can read frequently by moonlight, right? So the key thing here is that it happens from dark to bright very quickly. It happens from bright to dark much more slowly. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the lens. So within the eye, right, so the light passes through the cornea, it goes through the pupil that is governed by the iris, and then it strikes the lens, right? So the lens is actually malleable. We can change the curvature of the lens in our eyes so that we can focus light onto the back of the retina. Now, the thing that's responsible for changing that curvature are these things called the ciliary muscles. So the idea is that whenever you are looking at something that is what we call a near field or a midfield kind of object, your ciliary muscles are always contracted, right? They're always bending that lens to bring those parallel light rays or bring those light rays into focus on the back of your retina. So the only time you ever get to relax those ciliary muscles is when you look, say, at something that is far away, or what this slide is calling an object at infinity. So the idea is, from time to time, again, sort of making this practical, from time to time when you're at your desk, take some time, stand up, go and find yourself a distance horizon view that you can look at out the window, so you can look to horizon. You'll almost feel your ciliary muscles relax when you start to do that, right? This gives them a chance to relax, regenerate, recuperate themselves. This is one of the key reasons why when we are designing buildings now, we really want to have the ability to look out the window, right? We want to have the ability to have a view to a distance. Now this also, of course, circles back to 3 or 4 of the various biological imperatives that Bill Lamb left us with, right? We want to be able to see the territory around us. We want to be able to see daylight. We want to be able to see nature, other people, territory, what the weather is like, and all these things. So this is a really, really important guideline for people, right? Okay. So once the ciliary muscles have gone ahead and bent the light, what they're doing is essentially focusing that light on the back of the retina into this little tiny area called the fovea. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the fovea in just a minute, but at the fovea, we have this idea of rods and cones, right? So rods and cones are essentially the visual receptors that give us both black and white vision, or colloquially black and white vision, as well as color vision, right? So rods, there are 3 types of rods that correspond roughly to red, green, and blue, or short wavelength, medium wavelength, long wavelength stimulus. And then we have the rods that are much more sensitive, typically governed for night vision for the most part, right? The whole idea of scotopic vision versus photopic vision. So how does this kind of work, let's say, for color vision? Well, if we've got this idea that we've got 3 different types of cones, we'll notice that one set of cones, the short wavelength or high energy cones, tend to respond to what we perceive as blue colors, a range of colors. Green and red correspondingly move over. Now, what you'll notice from the, what you'll notice from this graph here is that the sensitivity of the types of cones varies widely, right? The bluer or short wavelength cones are much less sensitive than the red or long wavelength cones or green medium wavelength cones. So part of this has to do with the fact that these wavelengths are much higher energy than these wavelengths, right? The closer to blue, the higher energy content you're going to have within your wavelength. But again, as we keep talking about, how do we start to turn some of these things practical? Well, one of the interesting things is from a perception standpoint. Whoops, I have to give this back again. Here we go. From a color and perception standpoint, we've got this notion of color perception, right? So if we've got the idea that our highest perception or our most sensitive perception tends to be in that green part of the spectrum, right? So if we go back to this and we see this is our peak sensitivity, right? So let's give that back. Come on. There we go. This is why we started to see in the, say, 70s, things like fire trucks and personal protective gear being in this sort of greenish yellowish color rather than in things like red, because we actually perceive those colors more readily than we do the red. Now, interestingly enough, there was a study that was done in 1997, Stephen Solomon and James King, and they were looking at, you know, what's behind all of this stuff, right? Does it matter? It turns out, sort of, again, sort of colloquially condensing this entire big study, it turns out that one of the most dangerous things to firefighters is traveling from the station to the scene of the fire, because there are a number of crashes as they're trying to get there very quickly. So what these folks were able to find was that there was a much lower incidence of traffic crashes with the greener trucks than with the redder trucks, but that then also kind of coincides or really starts to run up against the very long-held cultural idea that a fire truck should be red. So it's an interesting clash between what we've traditionally done and what the scientific research is telling us is potentially the right thing to do from a perception standpoint. I hope that all makes sense to everybody. If not, you can ask questions as we push forward. Okay, so one big key thing about this is the whole idea of color discrimination. Now, there is a condition called color blindness, right? So this is a condition in which typically men, but not always, I don't think, typically men cannot perceive some of the colors that most of us can, right? This frequently occurs in red and green. My father, for example, and my nephew, my father was colorblind, my nephew is colorblind. He wouldn't be able to see the circle and the square that we see in the image here. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, in a lot of cases, it's not critical, right? So you're sitting at a red light and the light turns green. How do you know that the light has gone from red to green? Well, typically in the United States, right, red is on the bottom and green is on the top. Well, this is, of course, a trick that I usually do when we're having classes together. But the reality is red is on the top and green is on the bottom. Okay, so we know that when the light's on the top, we stop. When the light's on the bottom is go. That's how my father got through life. So imagine his surprise when we visited, you know, when I was a teenager, we visited Prince Edward Island in Canada, and we discovered that the traffic lights were not vertical, they were horizontal. Okay, so which one is red? Is it left or is it right? Fortunately, my mother and I were there to be able to tell him when to go, but it's an interesting thing. So you can't always assume that everybody can see the same colors, right? Okay, so we are going to do now a brief demonstration. If we were at the lab, I would be handing out to each of you a very complicated optical apparatus that consists of essentially a paper drinking cup that is a cone, and I'd have the end of the cone snipped off. I'd ask you to look through it and we'd talk about it. What I'm going to ask you to do now, hopefully all of you have the webcam going. If you can see, I am taking my fingers and I am putting them into essentially a little tunnel, and I'm going to bring them up to one eye and I'm going to close the other eye. And I'm going to look around for a moment and see what I see. I'm going to give you all just a moment to do that. I'm hoping that you're actually going to do it. This is on the honor system now, everybody. Okay. Everybody had a chance to go ahead and make a little tunnel, look through. Now, this is obviously not a terribly precise way to do this, but what you're looking at is essentially, let's call it a 2 or 3 degree cone or slice of your vision, right? So your vision is wide. You see a lot of different things. But what we call a medial vision is this little bit down the center, okay? So why does that matter? Well, that's what we're talking about when we talk about color vision, right? We talk about foveal vision. So actual foveal vision, the light that gets focused onto the fovea in the back of your eye, represents something like a 2 to 3 degree slice of the whole bit of vision that you see, right? Peripheral vision, not really part of it. When you turn, you then go ahead and focus on something. This happens autonomically. I mean, you don't really notice it. Why do we care? So it turns out that in this fovea, remembering that we have rods, colloquially blue, green, and red rods, cones rather, the fovea is dominated by red and green cones, the medium and long wavelength cones. So what does that mean for our perception of brightness? What does that mean for our perception of blue light, right? We have rods that are kind of distributed all around the retina. We have blue cones sort of also distributed in various places around the retina. But what we consider to be that medial foveal vision is predominantly given to us by those red and green cones. Okay, so that's really interesting, Shaun. Why are you telling us this? So we have this idea in the lighting industry called the luminosity function. It's also called the V lambda curve. What does that mean? Well, this is essentially a framework or a way to calibrate things like light meters, to calibrate things like lumens. How much light do you have? Well, that's calibrated primarily based on that V lambda curve, right? Based on primarily that foveal vision. So the key thing here is that it's not taking into account much blue. But there's a lot of discussion in the lighting industry right now. If actually I jump back for a few moments, when LEDs first started appearing, particularly in streetlights, a lot of the response was that they seem a lot brighter than other light sources. Well, okay. Interestingly, they had more blue in the content than, say, a high pressure sodium light would have had. So it was, you know, from a lumen per lumen standpoint, you had a lot more blue in the LED light source than you had in, say, the high pressure sodium or potentially metal halide light source. So there's a subset of the lighting industry that has suggested that we are really not counting the blue enough, and that there is some discussion about our metrics not really being accurate enough. So stay tuned. I mean, we haven't come to the point where we're going to be scrapping our light meters for new light meters yet, but understand that it is a discussion that's going on. Another part of that discussion sort of comes to the idea of color rendering index, right? We talked about color rendering index. So if we understand some of these things about the eye and about how we're perceiving things, is color rendering good enough, right? Is this going to be the metric of how we describe light moving forward? Well, CRI is a fairly simplistic way to think about some of these things, right? You had a reference source that used that was compared against a test source for 8 different pastel systems. Initially, it was a subjective test. It's more of an objective test now, and you know they've gone ahead and added in additional colors. Particularly the one everyone talks about is R9, which is the red that you see on the bottom there. But it still really doesn't tell us an awful lot from an understanding of the light source standpoint. So if we understand that we have these solid state light sources now, right, that we can manipulate the color temperature of, that we can manipulate the color spectrum of much more readily than we ever have been able to do before, we might understand that we can have 2 different light sources that have the same correlated color temperature and have the same color rendering index, and they may look very, very different to us based on whether what part of the Planckian locus they are on, whether they're above or below. Remember, that was the black body curve that we're talking about. So it's important to understand that CRI tells us a little bit. It doesn't tell us everything. It's very important to go ahead and do mock-ups with the actual light sources that you're using when you are going ahead and specifying them, purchasing them, buying them, whatever it happens to be. This circles us back to this Tommy Bahama headquarters. The image on the top there is showing you, we did a mock-up of the light sources that we might use for that particular project with several different color temperatures, several different specific spectra from one specific manufacturer that we knew we were going to use. And we actually had most of the designers for Tommy Bahama come in throughout the course of a day. I spent a day there, and they would bring their textiles that they were working on, and they would look at them under different light sources, and they would then be able to vote and say which light source they got to choose. This was a really important part of developing this particular project. But it's not just something like this. We did a great mock-up at the lab a couple of years ago where REI came in and they were looking at, what is their next accent light going to be, right, nationally. So there were several different candidates that they wanted to look at. So we put together a double-blind test for them. Their CEO, their merchandising people, a bunch of others came in and looked at their garments under the specific light sources without them knowing what the actual light fixtures were, so that they could pick the one that they really thought worked the best based on the light source. So that's really important. All right, so if CRI is not good enough for us, what do we do next? Well, we had this idea called the color quality scale, and that lasted briefly, but that really wasn't a great leap forward. What has been a pretty good leap forward is this whole idea of TM30. So TM30 is something that was promoted now by the IES. It's a method for evaluating light source color rendition. So instead of the 8 color samples or the extended range of the 16 color samples that we have in the upper right-hand corner there, there are 99 different color samples. And it offers some additional information for us, a little bit about the fidelity. So color fidelity is essentially what CRI is all about as well, but it also offers a bit of information about the saturation of the colors for the light sources, and it gives us some graphical tools that allow us to use things sort of intentionally. So the fidelity index, RF, is very similar to CRI, color rendering index. What this basically tells us is, like CRI, how well the light source is going to render color the way we expect it to be rendered based on the reference light source. What it also gives us, though, is this idea of color gamut, right? So gamut has a bunch of variables to it. What's the hue? Is it redder? Is it greener? Is it bluer? What's the saturation? Is there a lot of red in it? Is there a little bit of red in it? What's the lightness? Is it brighter or less bright at that particular thing? And you have the gamut index, RG, and basically anything that gives us above 100 value increases the saturation of light versus the reference source. Less than 100% decreases it, but it's not specific to the hue that you're actually looking at. What's interesting, though, is you wind up getting these vector graphics. Now, these vector graphics will show you the referent light source with different color kind of criteria around it, and then we'll also show you the tested light source. So in this example, what we see is that if we look here, we see that this is decreasing, right? That we're actually coming in a little bit less red there. So how do we start to use this stuff? Well, we can intentionally pick light sources based on whether they enhance certain colors or decrease certain colors, right? So let's say that we have a wall here. We've got three different views of it, and we want to bring out the red that's in the wall there. We might increase the amount of red that is in the light source that we're using intentionally so that we can bring out those red highlights. If we want to eliminate those, we would desaturate or decrease them. So we can pick and choose the light sources that we want based on this information. It's actually really incredibly powerful. It also takes a little bit of thought, but it is a wonderful, wonderful system. So we have had very little time to go through this. Unfortunately, the framework of this class doesn't give us a lot of time to talk about this. So here's a handy reference chart that gives you a little bit about how this works. And I would really encourage you, there's a really good, say 8 or 10 minute YouTube video with Michael Royer, who is one of the key people behind this TM30 from PNNL. And if you go to that link, you'll be able to watch a 10-minute or so really, really good layout of what this whole TM30 is all about, why it's useful, and how it can be applied much better than we can really do in this 2-hour class. Occasionally, also, if you're interested, we, the Illuminating Engineering Society of Puget Sound, have also had classes on TM30, and probably, I'm sure at some point will again. All right, so with that, we have reached another pop quiz. And this pop quiz is, what is the fovea? So let's launch this. So the fovea is either a small area of the retina on which light is focused, the densest location of red and green cones on our retinas, an obscure character in a delightful merchant ivory film, the basis for the calibration of light meters and the V lambda curve, or an area of the retina with few blue rods or cones. So the voting is open. Have at it. Do 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 do. All right, we've got 56% voted, 65% voted. You guys are good. Also be thinking, if you have any questions, we can open up for questions at the moment. All right, so we have about 75% voted. So the rest of you, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna put forward with this. So 56% of you believe it's a small area of the retina on which light is focused. 24% believe the densest location of red and green cones on our retinas. Nobody went for the merchant ivory film. I can't believe it. 12% for the basis for the calibration of light meters, and 8% an area of the retina with few blue cones. And of course, the answer is all but the merchant ivory film are correct. It is the little bit of the retina that we focus light on. It is also the densest location of red and green cones. That's where that lives. It is how we calibrate the light meters, at least for now, although again, there is some discussion in the industry about whether or not that is an adequate look at the way we think about lumens and also the way we think about brightness candela. And it's also an area of the retina with a few blue cones or rods. So that's a big part of that. So at the moment, are there any questions?
We are clear on questions, Shaun.
All right, thank you. Well, we shall push forward then. Let me close this. All right. So we have talked a little bit about the eye. We've talked a little bit about light sources and how we can describe them, and potentially how we can even manipulate them a little bit to our advantage. Let's kind of talk a little bit about how it all comes together. There's a fairly simple framework that I really like. If we were talking to that sensation and perception psychologist that I discussed at the beginning when we were talking about 80% of our environmental information coming through our eyes, they would break down, at least when I was in college, we broke it down into, I think, 27 individual steps of vision, right? For our purposes, let's break it down into 4 steps, because that's really, from a practical standpoint, what helps us. What you're seeing there is an image of my wife on one of our best ski days. This, of course, is pre-COVID. A couple years ago, we had the pleasure of a couple of knee-deep ski days over at Bridger Bowl in Montana with beautiful, fresh flyaway blower powder. Now, that's all great and all, but if we look at an image like this, how do we make sense of it? How does our brain interpret? How does our brain and our eyes and our whole visual system know to interpret everything that's going on in that image? Because in some ways, it's a delightfully simple image, right? It's somebody having fun skiing. But it's also an extremely complicated image, right, in a lot of ways. A computer would have a hard time understanding what was going on here, right? We've got a bunch of fir trees. We've got some aspen trees. We've got a whole bunch of snow. It's white on white on white. There's some gray there. And then, you know, in the middle of that, we have this figure that is somewhat reddish. Then we have her goggles, we have her helmet. How do we take this very complicated image and really start to break it down? Okay, so let's start with the notion of generators, right? So we have something that generates light, right? It's the sun, it's a candle, it's an LED light source, it's a fluorescent lamp. As we mentioned earlier, it kind of doesn't really matter what is generating the light. Now, there are going to be very big differences with respect to the color spectrum coming out of these, but light coming from a fluorescent lamp is light. Light coming from the sun is light. There's nothing magic about the sun. The fluorescent lamp is good as well, right? So if we have that basic understanding, we then jump into the idea of modifiers. What is a modifier? A modifier is something that takes that light source and changes it, right? So in the image on the left, you'll notice that it looks pretty blue. This is from a scuba diving trip that my wife and I went on a couple years ago. We're down at about 45, maybe 50 feet below the surface of the water. They're swimming with dolphins. And you'll notice that the light has been modified, the daylight has been modified by the water. Essentially, all of the, or most of the most of the long or medium wavelengths have been absorbed by the water, and it's the higher energy short wavelength blue light that's getting down further, right? So that's a modification. If we look at the REI Denver store there, every surface, everything that you see there is modifying the light, except the windows and the skylight. The windows and the skylight would be considered generators, right? But everything else essentially is taking the light. The gear that you're seeing is absorbing some wavelengths and reflecting other wavelengths, re-radiating them back to us. Perhaps the most famous modifier that re-radiates energy back to us is this one right here. Right? The moon, of course, does not glow. The moon is not a light source. The moon's a modifier. So the moon is reflecting sunlight back to us, right? So it takes the sunlight, it reflects certain wavelengths, it absorbs others, so it modifies that light. So we take that, and the next part of this is the encoder. Well, the encoder is simply your eyes, right? So the light passes through the pupil, over the cornea, gets focused onto the fovea, and essentially information is transmitted through the optic nerve into the brain. The brain is where the magic happens, right? It's the interpreter. So while the eye is important in this regard, what really gives us meaning is the brain, right? How we start to take this information and synthesize it into something that is understandable, right? Something that's cogent. So if we jump forward with that understanding, how do we take all of this stuff and make it practical again? If you think about this, pretty much everything that we perceive visually is all about contrast, right? A whole variety of different types of contrast. Brightness contrast, contrast in textures, contrast in colors, lots of different ways, but essentially the differences. So in a lighting standpoint, context is everything. Something that may objectively be very dim, for example, may feel subjectively fairly bright to us depending on the circumstances. If we are on a moonlit night on a beach, a light meter might tell us that the evening is very dark, but our vision and our interpretation of that scene that is lighted by the moon may feel fairly bright, right? So context is everything, right, as we jump through some of these things. So we can in particular start to look at some things like optical illusions, right? If we look at an optical illusion like this, we'll notice that we have black and white boxes. We also have gray in the center. Now, because we are looking at gray versus black or gray versus white, the gray on the left, of course, appears to us to be a lighter value than the gray on the right. Of course, the fact is they are the same color, right? They're the same color gray, but putting them next to each other matters. Similar example here, where the gray bars on the left are the same as the gray bars on the right. So these kinds of approaches of understanding how we take darker and brighter and higher contrast and lower contrast areas into our field of view really matters, right? So if you look at an example like this, is it going to be easier for the technician working on the left with a relatively lower contrast between what he is working on the table versus a relatively higher contrast with what he's working on the table? And it's a question, right? And it's a question for each of us to answer to a certain extent. Generally speaking, the practice of lighting design really is all about managing the visual world around us and managing the brightness and the contrast of the surfaces that we can see at any given point, right? That's fundamentally kind of what we do. We'll see some examples of that as we go through some key stuff. We can look at pattern contrasts. Our brain is remarkable at recognizing patterns, even when they change, even when they shift. This may be changing now with better neural network computers, but it used to be hard, for example, for a computer to recognize the pattern of something like, say, for example, a flag as it was moving. But it's relatively easy for our brains, right? But we use these strong patterns for things like buildings, so that we essentially use those patterns to help create meaning for us, to help to really push the perception of, let's say, if we wanted to make a building seem taller or seem squatter or seem wider or seem narrower, we can make use of the patterns that are around that to emphasize those kinds of desires, right? Here's a really good example. This is the Astrodome down in Texas. This actually comes from Bill Lamb's book. So this is a very old example, but it's still a great one. When they first made the Astrodome, they decided that they wanted to bring in as much natural light as possible so that the turf would actually grow. Problem was that if you're an outfielder and you're looking up into this pattern of these skylights, it's going to be really hard to track a ball, right? Somebody has a pop fly. So what they actually wound up doing was painting over all of these skylights and bringing in artificial lighting because the pattern contrast was just too great. Right? So it's a cautionary tale, but we really want to think about these things as we're looking at projects. Color contrast is another one, right? So in this case, you'll look, most of the background is blue, right? Relatively blue. What happens with, say, the red and the yellow jerseys that are in there? They really pop, don't they? So making use of color contrasts can really start to emphasize things and draw people's attention, which is important. Another thing that draws our attention is motion in our field of view. So this is all about the rods rather than the cones. So if we have, let's say, some kind of vision happening to the side, some kind of motion, this starts to elicit that whole fight or flight thing, right? So it attracts our attention. The rods function much faster than the cones function. So we then turn to face whatever that thing happens to be, and then our medial vision takes over, which is the color vision, which is the fine vision, to focus on what it is that we're looking at, right? All right, we are now to the next one of our pop quizzes, which of course is the famous, in the generator to interpreter to moderator framework, what is a modifier? Is it a luminaire or reflector? Is it a wall or ceiling? Is it the sun? Is it the human eye? Or is it your best friend? Take about a minute or so to go ahead and answer that stuff. Do, 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 do. I kind of want to be Alex Trebek here. Do, 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 do. All right, so a little bit more. You've got about 15 more seconds to let us know what your answer will be. This is critical, kids, critical. All right, let's go with that. So 38% of you think it's a luminaire reflector. 38% even thinks it's a wall or ceiling. Nobody thinks it's the sun. 14% thinks it's the human eye, and 10% believe it's your best friend. So, so a modifier is essentially anything that takes a light source and does something to it, acts on it. It either absorbs part of it, or it reflects part of it, or in the case of a lens, it refracts part of it. So the luminaire reflector absolutely is a modifier. Wall or ceiling absolutely is a modifier. The sun is not. The human eye was a trick, because technically in this framework, it's actually an encoder, but the reality is there is the cornea in your eye, and there's a lens. So those do in fact become modifiers, particularly as we age. So as we age, as the cornea yellows, as the cornea lens becomes less flexible, that does in fact become a modifier, and is something to think about, particularly with respect to the aging eye. And 10%, your best friend, absolutely. Your best friend, every human you've ever met, as long as there's a light source that is illuminating them, they are modifiers. They are absorbing some light sources and reflecting others. All right, with that, any questions thus far? I am still seeing no questions, so I'm hoping we're all good, and that life is grand. All right, so so we've talked about the eye, we've talked about light sources, we've talked about this framework. Let's talk a little bit about light and health. Unfortunately, we don't have as much time as I might like in this particular class to talk light and health, because this is a personal topic that I've been really spending a lot of time with. But we'll spend a couple of minutes here going through this. there's a lot of research going on right now, particularly with respect to the non-visual effects of light and how that impacts human physiology. And that includes things like circadian systems, sleep impacts, lighting for the aged. There's research going on about potential dementia implications for, in particular, light spectrum and quantity and timing of light application, blue light hazard, we're not going to talk too much about that, flicker and some others. But one of the key things that I think everybody in this call probably, hopefully will know, is that light has a central role in our circadian rhythms, right? Has a central role in governing our sleep-wake cycles, for example. So let's get a little bit of background on this. Interestingly, this kind of is not hugely new, some of this. In 1923, a fellow named Claude Keeler observed this interesting phenomenon. He's studying mice that were essentially functionally blind. As I recall, they didn't have any visual apparatus, rods, cones. So, or they had very severely degenerated receptors. What he found was really interesting was that when they were subjected to light, their pupils constricted. So if they have no visual receptors, why would their pupils be constricting when light was applied to them? Like, well, that was interesting, but it kind of went on to the laboratory shelf, and people didn't really think about that too much more until the early 2000s, when a group of people, if I'm recalling correctly, Ignacio Provencio and Semmer Hutter and others, were able to identify this new photoreceptor, first, I believe, in mice and then in humans. And the receptor was something that we call an intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. It just rolls off the tip of the tongue, right? Rods, cones, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. We'll call them IPRGCs from now on. But what we kind of started to discover, we as a species, was that these things were primarily involved in regulating the circadian timing cycle, right? Essentially resetting our circadian rhythm every day. So again, I'm being very, very simplistic here and bringing this down because we don't have a lot of time to get into the details of it. But essentially, what we found is that these cells have a direct role in, among other things, suppressing melatonin. Melatonin is one of the triggers that tells you that it's time to go to sleep, it's time to wake up, right? So what it also appears is that these don't have a specific role in our vision, right? In our either medial or our peripheral vision. So it's a really interesting kind of thing. Particularly, this is still being researched. What was really interesting is that there's not just one type of these things. There's at least so far discovered 5 different types, and they're wired into different parts of the brain. The one that we were most interested initially in was wired into what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So that's what does in fact help to regulate your sleep-wake cycle, right? Regulate your chronobiology. So this is stuff that we're really still researching how to make some of these things practical, but it's becoming something that is really, really being taken seriously by basically everyone. The last couple of, actually, I'm going to say every single IES or related conference that I've been to in the last, say, 3 or 4 years has been dominated by this stuff. Also by lighting controls, which is interesting. We'll talk about why that's interesting in a couple moments. But this has become a big thing, and it's information that is currently being discussed. We will have a lot more time to discuss this if when I teach a 311 class, 311 level class, which is a workshop. And if you're interested directly in this stuff, come to that. We have a lot more time to discuss it. But the big overarching thing is this whole idea of setting up what we call circadian entrainment. So the idea is that as humans, we actually have a daily cycle. And oddly enough, the daily cycle is not 24 hours. It's a bit more than 24 hours. And that cycle gets reset every day by essentially light. And there are several issues with respect to that. The one that most people have focused on primarily is the color of the light. So blue light, right? So essentially think of blue skylight, right? The idea is that, you know, we as a species have evolved to wake up in the morning and there's blue light coming from above us and that wakes us up, right? That alerts us in the morning, that suppresses melatonin, and we start our day cycle over the course of which eventually melatonin starts to build up again and the blue light goes away and we go to sleep. Again, that's incredibly simplistic, right? That's a very simplistic look at that. But color of light has been the thing that really the popular press has latched onto, right? If only we can just go ahead and modulate the light so that it's warm in the morning, cool in the afternoon, warm in the evening, we're going to be all saved. And there is something to that, right? The color of light does matter, but it's important to understand that it's not just the color of light. There are several key variables that we have with respect to this non-visual stuff. And those are intensity distribution, spectral power distribution, duration, timing, and photobiological history. Quickly stated, the intensity, how much light do we have? The distribution, where's the light coming from? Typically, we want it to be coming from above, right? So it's coming from this kind of way. Spectral power distribution, that's saying that light sources that have more blue in them do in fact have more efficaciousness with respect to the alerting functions and with respect to the circadian entrainment, but they're not necessarily the key thing. Intensity and distribution are also there. Duration, how much time is the stimulus occurring? Timing, when is the stimulus occurring? Turns out a high intensity of light in the morning from the proper angle is really what we're talking about. So you start to see things like the well building standard, for example, recommending a certain amount of light with a certain amount of blue in it for 4 hours in the morning in your workplace. It also matters what your photobiological history is. What does that mean? It basically means that as we talked about earlier, the human eye can see over 12 different ranges of magnitude, right? Orders of magnitude. But if you have relatively dark light in your office and you have very bright light at home in the evening, that's going to cause problems to you, right? Because that's not what we've evolved for. So what our bodies are expecting is relatively bright light during the daytime and relatively dim light at night. So that has some implications for light levels that we choose for offices or schools, for example. It also has implications for the light levels that we choose for our kitchens. So the good news about all of this, and apologies for covering that very quickly, is that we now have this whole idea of LED lighting, right? So from again, turning it practical matter, our dominant light source today is the light emitting diode that is very flexible, allows us to modulate color relatively easily. So from a variety of different color temperatures, we can even change those colors during the day. And it allows us to, most importantly, do dimming. So one of the most important things that we're going to see moving forward with respect to some of this light and health stuff is that lighting controls in particular are going to be more and more and more central and important for all of our projects. right? Because that variability, again, circling that back, even back to Bill Lamb's biological imperatives, that variability is what we're finding is really critical with respect to the whole circadian entrainment. So he didn't know anything about IPRGCs, but he did know that that was going to be important for us. So we've got this LED light source. How does this work a little bit? Well, white light LEDs typically tend to work more or less like fluorescent lamps, right? You have a blue light source in the fluorescent lamp, that's a mercury arc. In the LED white light, it's a blue light LED. And that light then strikes a phosphor, right? The phosphor then emanates additional wavelengths, gets excited and adds in those additional wavelengths. So it's really quite well understood. The interesting thing about LEDs is that there are so many different ways that we can create white light and that we can modulate the spectral power based on the LED itself, based on the phosphor mix, based on whether we're color mixing using different color LED chips, whether we're using red, green, blue. There are a lot of different ways that we can start to do this, right? And in fact, we can start to look at native colored LEDs, right? So one of the ways that we can potentially make white light is to use colored LEDs, tiny little ones on the same chip substrate, so that we can modulate color temperature during the day. Maybe we want to have relatively blue light during the daytime. Maybe we want to have relatively warmer light at night. That's fine. Remembering back to the original thesis of this talk, which is that there's no right answer, right? The best light for you is the light that you like. So the key thing here is that the confluence of the LED, how incredibly malleable it is, how incredibly adaptable it is, along with the modern control systems, means that we can control basically all of those variables, right? The intensity, the timing, the duration, all of those things become part of a unified whole in a lighting and lighting control system. All right, we are going to jump in now to, I think, what is our final pop quiz. Final pop quiz of the day. Oh, it's not the final pop quiz. It's nearly the final pop quiz. So, whoops, I hit the wrong thing, sorry. There we go. That's the right thing. Okay, so what are some characteristics that make LED light sources particularly useful for dynamic lighting systems? Nearly universal dimming capability, wide range available spectral power distributions, capable of mixing different SPDs in small packages, possible flicker adds to pleasing shimmer in the workplace, or small sources and high performance optics. 27% voting. Okay, gonna give you just a couple more moments. So 33% believe nearly universal dimming capability. 48% believe wide range of available spectral power distributions. 10% believe capable of mixing different SPDs in small packages. An excellent 0% believe possible flicker adds a pleasing shimmer to the workplace. And 10% say small sources and high performance optics. The answer, of course, is that all of these are correct except for the possible flicker. LEDs can flicker. Generally speaking, you get what you pay for. The higher quality LED and driver combinations are much less likely to flicker than the lower quality or lower cost LED gear. So it's really important, we said earlier, to do things like mock-ups. It's really helpful to go ahead and buy small samples of the gear that you're going to be using, making sure that things don't flicker. But all of the others actually are potentially useful, particularly for the light and health that we're all really interested in right now. So we're at really a good place in terms of these systems, particularly when we take the LED systems and add them into high performance lighting controls. Some of you have been to some of the network lighting controls classes that we've done. I would encourage any of you who haven't to go ahead and join us for one of those. Those will really start to tell you how these things can really help make not only better workplaces, but also really help with the whole light and health thing. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, Shaun, we have a question that was sent in through some back channels. I'm going to go ahead and read to you.
Okay.
If our biorhythms prefer blue light in the afternoon and dim in the evening, how does this affect people working night shifts? Is the question.
Oh, that's a big question. So generally speaking, what most of the light and health stuff is focusing on now is something called circadian entrainment, which is essentially the idea that you have this circadian rhythm, right? So you're essentially, to make it really simplistic, your sleep-wake cycle. And the idea really comes down to you wake up, you need to have enough intensity of light with enough blue in it from the correct angle to essentially suppress melatonin and bring you into an alert state. Now, that's hugely simplistic, by the way. So for most people, of course, that means that in the morning, when you get to work, you get a dose of light in the morning, or you get a dose of light driving to work or walking to work or bicycling to whatever it happens to be. Shift workers are a very different thing. And I'm gonna say that that's probably, there was a lot of research being done initially, particularly with respect to, say, nurses and the incidence of things like breast cancer. I'm going to tell you that I don't have enough current information in my brain about where those studies happen to be able to give you a cogent answer that I'd be willing to stand on. However, if you send us an email or send me an email about that, I will be glad to do a little bit more research and get myself more current in that aspect of the discussion, if that's fair enough. Any others? If you're going to design outdoor lighting, do you need less color temperature? If so, what is the preferred color temperature? The preferred color temperature, generally speaking, the industry is from Russell and De Los Santos. The industry, for a large percentage of the industry, is really pushing towards warmer light sources at night, so lower color temperatures, typically in the 2700 to 3500 Kelvin range, depending on what the application happens to be. So yes, I would say that if I'm designing a space today, I'm probably going to use a warmer color temperature. Now that contrasts with some of the early, say, street lights that were 4,000 to 6,000 Kelvin, right? And a big part of that was that in the early days of LED, the bluer lights were tremendously more efficacious. They're still more efficacious because you're not spending as much energy on phosphor transfer, but the warmer light sources are efficacious enough that that we're pretty much there at this point. What would be the most economical approach to fix general lighting that is LED but not currently on a dimming circuit? So that's from Marina Sanadad. Marina, that you can only see my webcam. Hold on. Oh, I have to close this. No, that is closed. Why can you only see my webcam? Ah, can you see that now?
That's great.
Okay, so last question. There's not a really great, there's not a really easy way to answer your question, Marina, unfortunately. If you have LED lights that are on, that are say dimmable via phase cut dimming, you may be able to go ahead and dim that way. You may also be able to add in lighting controllers from a specific system that may be able to retrofit easily in. That would be a real sort of detailed question that if you have a specific detailed question, send it to us and we'll try to answer it. Okay, moving on for the last little bit as we bring this ship into harbor. I'm going to give you some tips. I've tried to make this, and I try to make most of these classes as practical as I can while trying to give you the background information behind why we make some of these choices. But here are some very specific sort of tips, tricks, things that you can do you know, in the real world in order to make use of human perception and improve lighting. The first key is to start with daylight, right? Wherever you can, bring daylight into projects and view to horizon. This particular project happens to be the San Francisco Public Utilities headquarters down in San Francisco. And this slide in particular, this is not a hugely different room than any of the others. We wind up bringing daylight into the space fairly deeply, but we also allow the people who are working there to be able to see view. So this corresponds to so many of Bill Lamb's biological imperatives, right? You can see the territory, you can see the distance, you can see the weather, you can understand what's happening around you. It's a really wonderful kind of place to be in. Enhancing brightness perception. So one of the key things about lighting is that you know, we measure things like foot candles, right? We calculate things like foot candles, but that's not what we really see. What we see is the light that gets reflected off of the surfaces. So we see luminance, not illuminance. So this is one of my favorite examples to give because it was one of my favorite projects to design. So this is SeaTac Airport. The image on the right is what the lighting was there from the 1960s, which were these T12 very high output linear fluorescent slot lights up in this metal paraline ceiling. We renovated this in the late 1990s and essentially eliminated all of those light fixtures. They're still there because if you look up into that ceiling is a sea of asbestos. So the renovation in part was mitigating as little of that as we could. We kept it encapsulated, left it alone. But what we wound up doing was developing this system of indirect direct pendants that are around the perimeter. And then the ticketing wall there, that maple wall, we actually paid for that from the lighting budget so that we would have something to light. So essentially, we added that maple wall, then we added that wall wash system to make it glow. From the end result, the actual measured light level in there is significantly lower than it was before, right? So one would ask, why is this a victory? Well, from a perception standpoint, it feels brighter than it was before. So we've got light on the surfaces, we've got light on the wall. It becomes a civic beacon. It also used 60% less energy than the original system. So it was an energy win. It was a maintenance win. Much easier to maintain the system that's there now, and really, it's all about putting the light where you want it to be and directing attention. Right, it's very, very important. Finishes. So this is an interesting one. This is a Scottsdale Fashion Square Mall down in Scottsdale, Arizona. One of the key things that we were tasked with was making some changes in there. Interestingly enough, on one of these parking levels, they actually put in an acoustic ceiling tile, which was it's the only parking garage I've ever worked on that had an acoustic ceiling tile ceiling. But in most of these other levels, we recommended that they make sure that they paint out the ceilings white. I can't tell you how many times the best lighting retrofit you can possibly make, particularly in places like garages, is to paint the ceiling. You leave the lights alone, they're fine. But if you paint the ceiling, you make the surfaces brighter, that increases the perception of brightness within those surfaces, right? Okay. Targeted variability, going ahead and making areas that are brighter and areas that are dimmer. This is the Real Networks headquarters here in Seattle. Essentially, there are intentionally areas that are brighter and less bright. So that sort of comes back to that whole idea of variability that we've talked about, so that we are not always subjected to the same light level. We're not always subjected to the same stimulus. Things can vary, and that makes for a much more pleasant space. Also, coincidentally, saves energy because you are not making everything in the space as bright as everything else, right? Balancing contrast. We saw that example of the electronics worker earlier. This is a project here in Seattle, the University of Washington Molecular Engineering Building. One of the key discussion points was the color of the benchtop. You'll see there the benchtops are gray. This is frequently a discussion with lab planners and with architects and facility users. A lot of people are used to having black countertops. There are a lot of different reasons for that. One person actually told me that the reason that they liked black laptops was because it hides reagent spills well. That's fine, but that then sets up a real high contrast between a black surface and the other surfaces, the machinery, the reagents, the materials that you're actually using. So very frequently, even when we're talking about lighting, we're talking about light bouncing off of these surfaces. So we got involved, we the lighting designers got involved with the discussion of the benchtop. And in fact, whenever I design a lab, this is one of the things that I first go to is, what are the benchtop going to be? How can we minimize the contrast based on that, right? Daylight control, right? So bringing daylight into a space is half of the discussion. The other half of the discussion is advanced lighting controls, networked lighting controls, luminaire level lighting controls, whatever kind of controls you're going to use. This is my old office up in the Bullitt Center here in Seattle. And you can see a beautifully daylighted building, very wonderfully done by Miller Hall, and actually the Integrated Design Lab helped on the daylighting with this as well. So you'll notice that the light fixtures there in that daylighted area are all dimmed down. They're dimmed way down because there's sufficient daylight in there. You'll also notice that in the picture on the right there at night, or in this case on a Sunday afternoon when I took this photograph, poor Tony there is working, on a Sunday afternoon with only the light he needs on, rather than having all the lights on. Same thing down at the end. There's a woman named Mitria who is also working on this particular day. So lighting controls are important. We use light to set moods, right? In particular, one of the interesting things here is that you're seeing lighting surfaces become such a huge element, or choosing not to light surfaces. In the image on the left, we're lighting the surface. That gives one sort of feeling to the space. On the image on the right with the Pan Pacific Hotel in Yokohama, we're not lighting those surfaces, so that makes it a much more enclosed, introspective kind of space, right? Very, very different feelings. Agilent Technologies, this is a project that we did down in California some years ago. This is a before shot, right? We had traditional 2x4 parabolics with fluorescent lamps there. They gave so much brightness that we have one engineer who even created this tent to hide from the lighting, right? What we did was gave them a nice indirect direct system, much less glare, much less contrast, much better lighting, much lower energy use, by the way, and no more need for tents. So this was an approach of utilizing human perception, understanding that brightness matters to us more than measured light level on a horizontal surface. In Seattle here, Mu Library at Seattle University, this was a project with Pfeiffer Associates and Methuen locally. This was a wonderful project. You're looking at the exact same space right now, before and after, left and right. So general area volumetric lighting versus a more targeted lighting, and of course, the finishes. We no longer have black columns, we have light columns. We no longer have a brown wall in the back, we have a wall in the back that's worthy of being lighted. Much different kind of perception of space, and also, again, much less energy use. If we go up to the stacks, we look at the carrels that are there, the study carrels. This again is exactly the same space. On the image on the left, we see something called volumetric lighting, where we're basically putting a whole bunch of light into the space and hoping for the best. On the image on the right, we're targeted lighting. You'll notice we're only lighting that wall to enhance brightness perception. Right? There's also some ability to have task lighting at those carrels, but predominantly it's targeted approach, much, much lower light level, much calmer environment. Similar thing in the stacks, right? So we have that same light volumetric lighting approach coming through in the stacks originally, and what we replaced that with was an indirect, direct, linear line of light that lighted the surface of the books predominantly, again, for a small fraction of the energy, but a much higher utilization of the space and a much more comfortable environment. Right? So these are just some examples of how we actually make use of an understanding of how we as humans perceive the world around us, process the world around us, make use of the information that we see so that we can more effectively design and implement lighting systems that will also be saving us huge amounts of energy. I hope all that makes sense. So with that, we have now reached the final pop quiz. This is a very simple pop quiz. We're going to come to this one. 2 questions. Well, 4 questions actually. Launch. Is it better to light surfaces or volumes? Surfaces? Volumes? Wait, is this a trick question? Oh, look, a squirrel. What do you guys think? Wow, 67% surfaces, 5% volumes. Wait, is this a trick question? 14%, oh look, a squirrel. So it is kind of a trick question. I just showed you a bunch of places that it's really important to light surfaces, and that's true. When I have the opportunity to light surfaces, I light surfaces. And it's not always the opportunity. You can't always do it. So it's important to understand that you can do volumetric lighting, but it's not my go-to, right? When I have the option of lighting specific surfaces, I'm going to do that because that gives me the idea that I have brightness perception. And of course, you know, here I am at my home at stately Meadowbrook Manor, and just a little while ago, I have a squirrel that likes to scamper up the stairs that I can see out my window here. So look, oh look, a squirrel. So with that, let me close this and let me come back to this and say, that's basically my story for the day. This is a great example of a space that has both targeted surface lighting. You can see we lit some of the rosettes here very specifically from high performance custom LED light fixtures on the perimeter. But in the center, we're lighting entirely volumetrically, also with daylight. The daylight is adding to that volumetric lighting. So it's not always just one or the other. The key is to go ahead and be judicious and decide specifically how you want to approach spaces before just kind of jumping in. So with that, before I go into questions, I want to make sure that I jump through this. For those of you who don't know or haven't been to the Lighting Design Lab, here are some of the things that we normally do. Of course, these classes like this, mock-ups, consultations, we have online resources, all kinds of cool stuff. And we are here thanks to our partner utilities, in particular Seattle City Light, but essentially all of the utilities who work with us are essentially, and manufacturer partners, are essentially who allow us to be able to come and hopefully provide this valuable education for everybody who's here. At some point, you're going to be able to come back and visit us. We're, of course, in SOTO in the Seattle area. And when we're all past this, we'll all be back working again and very happy to see more people. So with all of that, let me cycle back and say, questions, comments, thoughts? Marina has, how can we dim the LED lights without adding low voltage wiring? So if you have LED light sources that are dimmable via what we call phase cut, which is to say you have a hot and a neutral, and like a phase cut dimmer is essentially think of it as a residential or theatrical dimmer. You can potentially do that. But more commonly, most LED light sources are 0 to 10 volt. Oh, look, Armando also answered that. Okay, good. Any other questions from the folks that are out here? Please go ahead and feel free to pepper us in. This is what we're here for. No more questions? All right, well, I'm going to say thank you to everybody who participated, particularly those of you who thought, oh, look, a squirrel. And John, do you have some thoughts?
Nope, you're doing great. I was just going to close this out, but you're doing a good job. So take us home.
Nope, close us out. You jump in. Thank you all for participating today.
Thank you all very much. We'll have a recording posted just as soon as possible. And if you have any questions that come to you after the fact, please don't forget to reach out to us at the Lighting Design Lab. We'd love to hear from you. Happy Tuesday, everyone.
Also, don't forget, please answer the questions you're about to receive, from the post-class, what is it, questionnaire, I guess I'm going to call it. Also, we are doing this, the next one, we're basically going to be doing this every 2 weeks. So forgive me, I should know, but I don't remember what the 1 and 2 weeks is. Do you guys know?
Yes, and actually the next online delivery for Lighting Design Lab is going to be this coming Tuesday.
That's right. That's right.
Called If Light Fair Would Have Been. For those who know, Lighting Design Lab usually does a post-game show webinar on Light Fair, obviously for reasons that we all know. And COVID-19, Light Fair has been canceled this year. So we'll be doing our take at an industry snapshot on the latest and greatest. So stay tuned and plug in.
I can't believe I forgot that.
Thanks, everybody.
See you later. Bye.